Hello. Today I'm gonna be making a short series of videos just describing stuff about special education for parents of students with disabilities, because a lot of people haven't really had experience with the system before until they are in the system. So there's lots of terms and stuff that are necessary to know. So I'm gonna start with the glossary of terms. So the first thing that is pretty widespread among like all types of plans and stuff that a disabled student would need is an accommodation, which would be anything that can help a student with a disability perform a task that a typical student would be able to perform. So this can be something like just looking at other students, like a step stool to get a little taller to reach something. But when we're looking at accommodations for disabled students, it can include like having an aide to help in the classroom, written out notes so they don't have to be taking notes, like hearing aids, or like a hearing loop installed in the classroom, just things like that that would help the student based on their disability. So individualized things that will help the student be able to perform the task to the same level that a typical student would be able to perform the task. When we're making accommodations, a lot of the times, or pretty much every time that a student would get accommodations from the school, a student is going to have, or in a public school, a student is going to have a 504 plan or an IEP. A 504 plan is going to be a little bit more generalized, so it'll be something that the school is supposed to follow, but it's not something that they'll get as much like additional funding for, and it's not quite as strict to qualify for. So a lot of students will qualify for a 504 plan that won't necessarily qualify for an IEP. That being said, it's not quite as all-encompassing, so they will still have accommodations, they will still have things like that, but it won't be as like strict and severe as an IEP is. So this is going to be if a student's disability isn't quite so, not necessarily severe, but like affecting their education, as it could be. So then when we're looking at an IEP, this is still going to have those accommodations, but it's a longer process of getting the accommodations. There's a whole team of people that work in it. Schools get more funding to be able to accommodate students that have IEPs, so the accommodations can be a little bit more like bigger things, and it's like legally schools have to follow it. There's lots of processes that have to be followed to make sure the student is being served correctly. So when we're making the IEPs, a big thing that is important is having goals or objectives for students. So those are going to be like educational goals, but also like functional goals, for like behavior, things like that, or even like post graduation. So if you have a student that maybe has like an emotional regulation issue, then their goal might not necessarily be academic. It might be to like not be harming themselves based off of like perceived failure, things like that. And that is a goal that can be put on an IEP, even though that does mean an individualized education plan. It doesn't necessarily have to be an educational goal, but it can be. It can include things like improving math skills or reading skills and things like that. And these goals have to be measurable and specific. The next thing in a long list of acronyms I'm going to go over is a free and appropriate public education. That's something that all students are entitled to. So schools can't just decide to not serve a student because they have a disability. They are like legally required to admit any student. So even if they haven't had a student that uses a wheelchair in the past like 50 years, they're going to have to make sure they have a ramp and things like that that are able to accommodate the student, that at no cost to the parents or guardians of the student, and also that is appropriate. So they're not going to be like a 10-year-old in a class with kindergartners because they can't speak or something like that. Like it's going to be on level and appropriate for them, and it has to be legally. That is a legal requirement. The other thing with that kind of goes along with what I was talking about before is LRE, which means, least restrictive environment. And this is going to be making sure that students are in an environment where they are able to thrive, but also not being just considered a special education student, having one spot for them. So for example, if there's a student that has autism and they maybe struggle a lot with math and science, and they need a lot of help in math and science, they can still be in a general education classroom during reading and social studies and things like that, but they can go to like the special education classroom or the resource room for math and science help, but they're still involved in the general population and they're welcome there, so they're not being forced into a more restrictive environment where they're going to have more one-on-one help that they don't need, and they're going to be empowered to be able to like do the skills that they're able to do. The next thing are some like law acts. So we have the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is where the IEP comes from. That is like legally mandated in there. And there's a bunch of other things like professional development. And under IDEA, it also mandates that there are services that are available for like children from birth to 2 years old. So even when they're not in school, they're able to get services and early intervention stuff. So those are like legal things that you're able to get for your student, for your child with a disability, to make sure that they're able to progress and meet their full potential. The next thing would be the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is going to be things that affect students like post education. So when we're making like transition plans for when they are going to be graduating and things like that, the ADA is going to make sure that they're able to like go into buildings, even if they have a mobility aid and things like that. So it's going to make sure that they are not discriminated against in the workplace and things like that. And there are some educational implications, but not so many as the IDEA. The next thing is ESSA, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which kind of came from No Child Left Behind, but isn't quite the same thing. And this is kind of making sure that there's like requirements that schools are making sure that their students do succeed. And it's done in a way where students are being assessed and checked up on, but it's not quite as like strict where people are going to just push children along or anything like that. It's very much like plans to improve and plans to keep students like progressing. And this gets checked up on about every 3 years. The next things with like the legal stuff is due process. And this is just making sure that students are having their rights followed. So parents have rights for their student that they're able to act on to make sure that they're not being discriminated against. And also make sure that schools are doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing and treating the students with disabilities as they should be treated and not violating any of their rights. And that's something I'll go into a little bit more later. And the last thing is AT, which is assistive technology, which is something that probably could have been talked about a little bit before, but that's just things that could be added to an IEP or a 504 plan that are going to help the students. Like I was talking about hearing aids and a hearing loop. And it can even be something so simple like as having like fidgets or something for a student to focus on. It doesn't have to be high tech, but it is just any like technology that'll help the student to function. So those are the things that are frequently used in special education that a lot of people might not know. And now on to the next video of what to expect in an IEP meeting.